Hello and welcome, everyone. On October 1st, 1913, the small village of Landreau in Loire-Atlantique was shaken by a crime of rare brutality. Six members of a wealthy farming family, the Mabits, were found slaughtered in their home. A massacre beyond comprehension. Faced with the horror and sheer violence of the scene, the gendarmes were left stunned. But it wouldn't take them long to uncover the person behind the murders, a young servant barely 15 years old named Marcel Redureau. How did this obedient, timid, and seemingly harmless teenager end up committing such a savage act? That's what I invite you to discover with me in today's criminal case. Le Landreau, hamlet of Basse-Briace, September 30th, 1913. In the vineyards of the Nantes region, the grape harvest is coming to an end. The last few days have been devoted to pressing the grapes, still done by hand at the time. The precious plum-colored juice is then collected and divided into vats for fermentation. For white wine, pressing is done quickly after the harvest to avoid maceration. The day of September 30th, 1913, is unusually mild, and by sunset, workers are still busy at the wine press, lit by the glow of a lantern. The final barrels need to be filled, sealed, and taken down to the cellar. Inside the house, Madame Mabit and her maid, Marie Dugas, are sewing, waiting for the men to return for dinner, which will be shared in the large dining room. The children are already in bed. Madame Mabit sets aside the doily she's been embroidering and gently strokes her belly, swollen with 8 months of pregnancy. The baby is due soon. "I hope the doctor won't be drunk like last time," says the young maid, glancing nervously at her mistress's belly. "I hope so too, Marie," replies the expectant mother gravely. "I'll go warm up the soup." The evening promises to be peaceful, but this calm won't last. In just a few moments, the unimaginable will happen. The next morning, dawn has barely broken. Madame Durand, jug in hand, sets out, as she does every morning, to fetch milk from her neighbors, the Mabit family. But as she approaches the farmhouse, she's surprised to find little Pierre Mabit, just 4 years old, sitting alone in front of the gate. He's crying. "Where's your mother?" the woman asks, alarmed. "She's inside, and she's all covered in blood," he replies through sobs. Madame Mabit is heavily pregnant. Madame Durand assumes it must be a premature delivery. "I just hope everything went well," she murmurs. She heads back home, deciding she'll return later to check on her neighbor and see how she's doing. On the way, she runs into the village blacksmith, Mr. Gou. Unable to keep it to herself, she tells him what she's just seen. Worried, he decides to go check for himself. The house door is shut. He has no choice but to push open the kitchen shutters to gain entry. That's when he sees them. Madame Mabit and her maid, both lying in a pool of blood. From that moment on, a shadow falls over this peaceful village, a village that had never witnessed such a heinous crime. 1 year earlier, at the start of the 20th century, France is experiencing renewed interest, thanks in part to the World's Fair, which brought global attention to Paris. In the countryside, however, farming communities still deeply tied to century-old traditions are beginning to change, slowly influenced by growing industrialization in some regions. In Landreau, a small village halfway between Nantes and Poitiers, modern life still feels far away. Here, daily life is shaped by farming work, the rhythm of the seasons, and religious obligations. The locals live under often difficult conditions. Most are farmers, livestock breeders, or craftsmen, earning a modest living. In these rural areas, education remains basic, despite the school reforms introduced by Jules Ferry. Children learn to read and write, but many leave school by the age of 11 or 12 to work on farms and help support their families. Respect for authority is absolute, whether it be that of the father, a master, or an employer. Discipline is strict, and young people have little choice but to obey. Wealthier farmers often hired this cheap labor, young, strong, and readily available, which over time simply blended into the scenery. Most of these farm boys, stable hands and servants, ended up staying their entire lives in service to the same family. Some employers were kind and generous, but others ruled with an iron fist, knowing full well that no one, not even the boys' parents, would ever hold them accountable. Bullying and physical punishment were common practice. As a result, relations between landowners and farm workers were often tense, shaped by an unequal power dynamic and a sense of underlying resentment. It was in this world that a boy named Marcel Redureau grew up. Born in 1898 into a farming family from Couffet, Marcel faced hardship from an early age. His parents had 9 other children and couldn't offer him a future beyond the neighboring farms. Although illiterate himself, Marcel's father made a point of raising his children properly. He insisted they attend school and pass down strong traditional values, respect for the law, and personal integrity. Marcel, the fifth of 10 siblings, was a quiet, unremarkable child. At the local school, he was a good student, and his teacher was pleased with his work. At 11, he earned his primary school certificate with success, but that would be the end of his formal education. That same year, he was hired to work on his great-uncle's pig farm as a livestock keeper. The elderly man was pleased with the boy's work. Marcel was well-behaved, obedient, and never complained. At the age of 13, he was placed as a farmhand with the Mabit family, taking the place of his older brother, who had been called up for military service. The Redureaus and the Mabits, whose farms were near each other, got along well. The Redureaus had many healthy boys eager to work. The Mabits had money. The family consisted of Jean-Marie, 40 years old, his wife Jeanne, 38, and their 4 children, 2 daughters, Marie and Henriette, and 2 sons, Joseph and the youngest, little Pierre. The paternal grandmother also lived with them. In their service were a maid, Marie Dugast, and a farmhand, Louis Lemaitre. Mabit was a respected man in the community. A successful wine grower, he owned a fine estate and employed several workers. He was demanding and sometimes harsh, intolerant of laziness or backtalk. From the moment Marcel arrived, he was constantly scolded. Only Madame Mabit and the grandmother showed him any kindness. "Marcel, move it for heaven's sake. You think we've got all day?" "Yes, sir, I'm hurrying." Jeanne was devoted to her family, always looking after her children and keeping the household in order. Her young maid, 15-year-old Marie Dugas, was clever and followed her around like a shadow. Days at the farm were long, shaped by hard work, shared meals, and Sunday Mass. As a farmhand, Marcel was tasked with the roughest jobs, feeding pigs, gathering hay, cleaning the stables. It was grueling work for a teenager, and the atmosphere was often heavy, but he knew his case wasn't unique. Boys like him all lived the same way. Moreover, Mr. Mabit wasn't known for his patience, and tensions mounted day by day. Yet when he took Marcel's wages to his father, he expressed satisfaction with the boy's performance and had no intention of letting him go. Marcel wasn't a troublesome child. In fact, he was too quiet. Small and frail, he didn't seem the type capable of violence, and yet something was beginning to stir inside him. Now that he had just turned 14, he couldn't help but feel humiliated by the constant criticisms from his employer. He may have dreamed of a better life, but the harsh reality of rural labor trapped him in an unbearable routine. No one truly noticed his inner suffering. In the countryside, emotions weren't discussed, let alone psychological distress. A child was expected to obey and to work, and that was that. Adults were used to being strict, their way of preparing children for the hard life ahead. No one suspected that behind his silence, Marcel was harboring a growing bitterness toward everything around him. It was the hardest time of the year, lasting from late July to the end of September. Days usually started at 4 or 5 in the morning and didn't end until 10 at night, broken up only by meals. The grape harvests were vital in the Landreau region, especially for the famed Muscadet wine. Profits were high, and every wine grower knew it. It was a season filled with both cheer and relentless labor. As soon as one task was finished, another had to begin, with no end in sight. Amid this chaos, Marcel kept to himself. The older men, stronger, more confident, and more attractive, intimidated him. Unmoved by the cheerful atmosphere brought by the seasonal workers staying at the farm, Mr. Mabit was particularly irritable, angry, and impossible to please. To him, no one worked fast enough. Vats, barrels, the wine press. Those were the only things on his mind. Marcel was his favorite target. "For God's sake, you still haven't cleaned the vats. If I have to say it again, you can pack your things." "I'm doing my best, sir." "Not good enough. We're not here to do our best. We're here to get it done right. The buildup of frustration, humiliation, and exhaustion became harder to bear by the day. The final straw came when Mr. Mabit raised his fist at him in front of the other workers as they ate lunch in the vineyard. That act, insignificant to the employer, would push young Marcel to a breaking point. On September 30th, 1913, the day began like any other. Most of the seasonal workers had already left the farm, returning home to Nantes or Vendée. Around noon, Mabit and Redureau returned to the house for lunch. During the meal, a dispute broke out. Mr. Mabit, visibly angry, scolded Marcel for what he claimed was negligence in his work. But this time, instead of staying silent as usual, Marcel dared to answer back. He defended himself, insisting he worked himself to the bone, and still, nothing ever seemed good enough. Tension rose quickly, and Madame Mabits had to step in to calm things down. "That's enough. We're at the table. Marcel, take your plate and eat outside. Marie, give him another slice of bread. Go on now. Out." Later that evening, Mr. Mabit, having already forgotten the lunchtime quarrel, ordered Marcel to join him at the wine press to help gather the last barrels. They stayed there until 10 p.m. And then, everything changed. In a sudden fit of rage, Marcel grabbed a billhook lying nearby and struck his employer on the head. Mabit collapsed, but Marcel didn't stop. He kept hitting him over and over, unleashing all his fury on the man's body. Blood splattered across the walls and the floor. The violence was extreme, but the massacre didn't end there. Marcel realized he couldn't leave any witnesses. He returned to the house and butchered the 8 months pregnant Jean Mabit. He slit the throat of the maid Marie. He murdered the grandmother. Then, in a final descent into horror, he killed the children: 8-year-old Marie, 7-year-old Henriette, and 2-year-old Joseph, cutting them down one by one. He left only one survivor, 4-year-old Pierre. In just a few minutes, the Mabit farmhouse had turned into a slaughterhouse. Then silence fell again, broken only by the distant sounds of animals in the stables. October 1st, 1913. As she did every morning, Madame Durand came by the Mabit farm to collect milk. She was surprised to find little Pierre sitting alone at the gate. When she told Mr. Gu, the village blacksmith, he didn't hesitate to go check. He was the first to discover the scene of the massacre. By the time the gendarmes arrived, a crowd of neighbors had already gathered. "Make way!" one of the officers shouted. But when he and his colleague came back out a few minutes later, their faces were pale. Inside, blood covered the floor and splattered the walls. The mutilated bodies left no doubt. The attack had been savage. Except for little Pierre, the entire family had been wiped out. It was obvious the killer had shown them no mercy. But the most shocking sight was the mother. Her pregnant belly so brutally slashed it was unrecognizable. Who could commit such a massacre? Did the Mabits have enemies? Had someone hated them enough to do this? As expected, the news spread through the village like wildfire. Meanwhile, the gendarmes sent a telegram to the public prosecutor. "Marcel? Has anyone seen Marcel?" someone in the crowd asked. Indeed, Redureau was not among the victims. He was nowhere to be found. Some villagers assumed he had met the same fate, that perhaps his body was hidden somewhere. "We have to find him," one of the brigadiers insisted. The Redureau farm was just 500 meters from the Mabit estate. When the gendarmes arrived, there was still no sign of the boy. His mother, in panic, cried out, "What happened? Who did this? Was my son killed too?" The gendarmes said nothing and began searching the property. Then they reached the barn. When they pushed the door open, they found Marcel inside, dazed, confused, and covered in blood. His disoriented state and lack of an alibi said everything. When the gendarmes asked him to explain, the teenager quickly confessed and described in chilling detail the night of horror he had just lived through. The officers were stunned all the more so because Marcel spoke in a flat, emotionless tone as he recounted the terrible events. "The day before, Mr. Mabit woke us up at 4 in the morning. It was a long day. When night fell, we were still at the wine press. While he was pushing the bar that turns the screw, I was helping from atop the vat. Suddenly, he started shouting at me, calling me lazy. We had already argued earlier that day about the same thing. That was it," I snapped. "I climbed down, grabbed a pestle, and struck him hard on the head. He collapsed. He was groaning in pain. I saw the blood flowing from the back of his skull. Now that Marcel was slowly coming to his senses, the gravity of what he had done hit him. Dark thoughts started haunting him. He would be arrested, tried, and guillotined. No, he couldn't face that. Despite his exhaustion, he was unable to sleep. At dawn, he made a decision to end his life once and for all. He left the Mabit farm and walked toward a nearby pond. He hesitated a moment, then removed his shoes and jacket and began wading into the cold water. He stepped in up to his knees but stopped. He didn't have the courage to go through with it. Drowning was not the answer. In a sudden motion, he turned back to dry land, put his shoes back on, and ran into the countryside. He decided to hide at his parents' farm. At the far end of the garden stood an old building used as a barn. Around him, everything was quiet. His parents and siblings were already asleep. Marcel climbed to the upper floor and lay down on some old burlap sacks. Overwhelmed by fatigue, he fell asleep. Redureau is a normal adolescent with no physical or mental disabilities. He harbored no hatred, had not been drinking, and was not unusually tired. Nor could he have been poisoned by fumes from the wine press where he worked that day. No, his murderous frenzy seems to have been triggered by a harsh and unjust insult from Jean-Marie Mabits, who called him lazy. This detailed report from the medical experts would serve as a crucial document throughout the trial. Major newspapers, Le Matin, Le Petit Parisien, and Le Phare de la Loire, competed to publish photos of Marcel Redureau, the crime scene, and the victims. The horror of the massacre was described in every gory detail. One headline read, "The grim memory of the Pantin massacre has barely faded, and yet a case even more macabre now shakes Barbaric in Loire-Atlantique." On the evening of September 30th, 1913, a 15-year-old farmhand, Marcel Redureau, murdered his employer, his 8 months pregnant wife, the grandmother, 3 children, and the maid, sparing only a young boy who remained silent during the slaughter. Some journalists exaggerated Marcel's physical appearance for added shock value. This kid is barely more than a child, with an underdeveloped body. Seated behind a table, you wouldn't even notice him standing. He's barely boot height. A big head with very blonde hair that falls over a broad, bulging forehead, blue eyes, and the vacant gaze of a calf. Others reported that he stood 1.60 meters tall, taller than the average boy of his age at the time. They described him as an ordinary, even gentle boy, far from the brutish image typically associated with murderers. Even the murder weapon drew attention. It's a wine-press knife, what winemakers call a grape knife, the same kind used during the war in the Vendée. It's a mix between a billhook, an axe, and a scythe. Mounted on a wooden handle, the blade is long, wide, and razor-sharp, 65 centimeters in length, 13 centimeters wide, and weighing 2.5 kilograms. Truly a deadly weapon, even in the hands of a weak boy. On October 4th, 1913, the funeral for the Mabit family and their housemaid is held. In the procession following the 7 coffins, emotions run high. The church in Landreau is far too small to hold the large crowd that has come to attend the service, forcing many to remain outside. Marcel Redureau is initially placed in the Nantes prison, awaiting the setting of a trial date. The trial finally opens on March 3, 1914, at the Assize Court of Nantes, 6 months after the events. All the residents of Barbaric and nearby villages travel to attend. The entire trial revolves around one haunting question: how could a 15-year-old boy with no prior signs of violence commit such a massacre? Psychiatrists called to testify unanimously conclude that Marcel suffers from no form of insanity. He was fully conscious of his actions, acting in a sudden burst of uncontrollable rage. Prison guards testify that Marcel has made several suicide attempts, but never had the strength to follow through. "What do you have to say for yourself, Redureau?" asked the judge. Standing in the dock, head down, Marcel mutters with a sulking tone, "The boss made me angry by calling me lazy and clumsy. I was afraid his wife would come into the cellar and see him. I hit the maid because she was with the boss's wife. I hit the others because they were screaming. I didn't touch little Pierre because he stayed quiet and was asleep. After deliberation, the jury confirms both premeditation and full awareness. Marcel is found guilty of all 7 murders. The court shows no leniency. The room falls silent. Everyone braces themselves, expecting the young blonde boy's head to soon meet the guillotine. But due to his age, the court sentences him to 20 years of criminal detention in a juvenile correctional colony in the Lot-et-Garonne region. He is later transferred to Fontevraud prison, where he dies of tuberculosis in 1916 at just 18 years old. Marcel Redureau never denied the crime. He was neither a gangster nor a hardened criminal. To this day, it remains unclear whether it was exhaustion, harsh labor, or long-suppressed injustice that pushed him to unleash such violence. At a time when mass killings were nearly unheard of, especially in rural France, his story shocked the nation and left a lasting mark, just as France was entering World War I. 2 books have since been dedicated to the case: D'écume et de sang by Christophe Bessler, published in 2022, and L'affaire Redureau, Le crime de Barbaric by Sophie Victorien and Pierre Guillard.